For a year and a half, they built it. Piece by piece, week by week, the single greatest long-term story professional wrestling had ever told. A silent man in the rafters, painted like a ghost, staring down at the villains who had taken over his home. Millions of people tuned in every single Monday night for one reason above all others, to see the moment he finally came down from those rafters and took his revenge, to see good finally conquer evil, to see the hero win. And on December 28th, 1997, that moment finally arrived. The most anticipated match in the history of World Championship Wrestling, Sting versus Hollywood Hulk Hogan, the blow-off to 18 months of the most masterful storytelling the industry had ever produced. It should have been the greatest night in the company's history, a payoff so satisfying that fans would talk about it with tears in their eyes for the rest of their lives. Instead, it became the single most infamous disaster in wrestling history. A night so badly bungled, so thoroughly sabotaged from within, that many historians point to it as the exact moment World Championship Wrestling began to die. Not the moment it started losing, the moment it started dying. In this video, we're going to uncover the dark truth behind Starrcade 1997, the backstage politics, the secret contract clause that gave one man the power to override the entire company. The referee caught in an impossible situation, receiving two completely contradictory sets of instructions from the two biggest stars in the building, and the afternoon decision made just hours before the biggest show of the year that quietly gutted the most important match WCW would ever promote. Because what the 17,000 fans in that arena didn't know, what the hundreds of thousands of people at home paying nearly $30 didn't know, was that the ending they were about to witness had been changed. Not for creative reasons, not because it made the story better, but because of ego, fear, and the kind of locker room power games that eventually consume everything they touch. By the time we're done, you'll understand exactly how a company at the absolute peak of its power, a company that was beating the mighty World Wrestling Federation week after week after week, managed to take its biggest opportunity and turn it into the beginning of its own funeral. But to understand how badly they got it wrong, you first need to understand just how right everything had been going, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. Let's go back to the summer of 1996. At that point in time, World Championship Wrestling was a company on the rise, but it was still living in the shadow of Vince McMahon's empire. That was about to change forever. On July 7th, 1996, at an event called Bash at the Beach, professional wrestling changed in a way it never had before. Two invaders from the World Wrestling Federation, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, had been terrorizing WCW for weeks, promising a third man would join their hostile takeover. When that third man finally revealed himself, the entire wrestling world stopped breathing. It was Hulk Hogan, the biggest hero the business had ever known. The red and yellow immortal who had told an entire generation of children to say their prayers and eat their vitamins. And he turned his back on every single one of them. He dropped the leg on Randy Savage, tore off his shirt, and spat on the fans who had loved him for over a decade. The New World Order was born, and with it, the hottest angle in the history of the industry. The NWO felt real. That was the genius of it. These weren't cartoon villains in bright costumes. They were cold, black and white invaders who acted like a hostile corporation, trying to seize control of a rival business. They spray painted their logo on the backs of beaten opponents. They interrupted broadcasts. They recruited defector after defector until it seemed like nobody in the entire company was safe. Every week, the group got bigger and more dangerous, and every week, WCW looked more helpless to stop them. And it worked in the real world, not just the fictional one. Like WCW's flagship show, Monday Nitro, went head-to-head against the World Wrestling Federation's Monday Night Raw in a ratings battle that came to be known as the Monday Night Wars. And on the strength of the NWO, WCW didn't just compete, it dominated. For 83 consecutive weeks, Nitro beat Raw in the television ratings. 83 weeks. Think about how enormous that is. The company that had spent years as an afterthought was now the #1 wrestling promotion in the entire world. And it wasn't even close. Eric Bischoff had taken Ted Turner's money and Hulk Hogan's star power and built a machine that had Vince McMahon, the most powerful man in the business, on the ropes and reeling. And in that environment of chaos and paranoia, WCW pulled off the single smartest creative move of the entire war. They took their most loyal soldier and they broke his heart. Sting had been the franchise of WCW for years. The bleach blonde, face-painted, energetic hero who bled for the company through thick and thin. He was the ultimate good guy. Trustworthy, dependable. The man who would never, ever betray his own. So the NWO did something diabolical. They introduced a fake Sting, an imposter dressed in identical face paint and gear, who attacked WCW wrestlers and then disappeared into the night, making it look like the real Sting had joined the invasion. And here's where the story became something special. The WCW locker room, the men Sting had fought alongside for years, they believed it, they doubted him. They questioned his loyalty. And when the real Sting tried to explain that he had nothing to do with it, that he would never betray them, they turned their backs on him. There was one unforgettable moment where Sting stood in the middle of the ring and confronted the very idea of that betrayal. He came down, dropped the imposter, and then delivered a message to the entire company that had turned on him. He told them that he no longer needed their trust or their approval, that the only thing anyone needed to know about Sting was that nothing was for sure anymore. And then he walked away. That was more or less the last time the world would hear his voice for over a year. He had been wronged and he was done explaining himself. That betrayal changed everything. Sting walked away, he disappeared. And when he came back, he was a completely different man. The inspiration came from an unlikely source. Scott Hall, one of the very invaders tormenting the company, had watched the 1994 film The Crow, and he suggested a new look for Sting based on it. Gone was the colorful, smiling hero. In his place stood something haunting. A pale face split with stark black paint, a long black coat, a baseball bat resting on his shoulder, and most powerful of all, complete and total silence. The new Sting didn't wrestle, he didn't cut promos, he didn't say a word. For over a year, he simply appeared. He would descend from the rafters of the arena on a cable, or emerge from the shadows backstage, and he would strike at the NWO before vanishing again into the darkness. He became a phantom, a silent avenger stalking the villains who had taken his home and his name. Think about the restraint that took in an industry built on talking, on shouting, on larger-than-life characters screaming into microphones. WCW made their biggest star completely silent for over 18 months. The last time Sting spoke publicly before all of this would be in the fall of 1996, and he wouldn't truly speak again until January of 1998. That is an eternity in professional wrestling, and it worked. Every single appearance became an event. Every time those lights flickered and that spooky music began to play, the crowd would erupt because they knew he was coming. And they knew that eventually all of this was building to one thing. Sting was going to come down from those rafters and he was going to destroy Hulk Hogan. WCW understood exactly what they had. They refused to rush it. They held the match back from every pay-per-view, teasing it, protecting it, saving it for the one show that mattered most. Starrcade, the company's flagship event, their version of WrestleMania, the tradition that stretched back to 1983 when it debuted in Greensboro, North Carolina, and had been the stage for some of the most important matches the business had ever seen. This was where legends were made. This was the show that helped turn Ric Flair from a regional attraction into a national icon. And this was where the greatest story WCW had ever told was finally going to reach its conclusion. By the time December of 1997 rolled around, the anticipation was almost unbearable. This wasn't just a match, this was the payoff to a year and a half of investment. Every fan who had watched the NWO run roughshod over the company, every viewer who had felt that surge of hope every time Sting appeared, they were all going to get their reward. The hero was going to slay the monster. Order was going to be restored. It was the most obvious, most necessary, most anticipated finish in the history of the sport. All WCW had to do was not mess it up. The numbers tell you everything about how big this was. Starrcade 1997 emanated from the brand new MCI Center in Washington, D.C., and it was a complete sellout. 17,500 fans packed the building, but the real story was on pay-per-view. The event drew somewhere around 700,000 buys, making it the highest grossing pay-per-view in the entire history of World Championship Wrestling. It grossed roughly $18 million. It posted a buy rate of nearly 2 full points, which in the pay-per-view business of that era was staggering. It was, by some measures, the third biggest pay-per-view event of the entire year across all of combat sports, trailing only a couple of major boxing matches. Let that sink in. Hundreds of thousands of people opened their wallets in numbers WCW had never seen before and would never see again, all to witness one moment, all to see Sting beat Hogan. The company had built the perfect story, promoted it to perfection, and delivered the audience. The hardest part was done. The audience had already paid. All that remained was to give them the ending they had earned. And this is where the dark truth begins. Because behind the curtain, in the hours leading up to that main event, a very different drama was unfolding. A drama that the paying customers would never see, but which would poison the entire evening, and at the center of it set a contract clause that would ultimately do more damage to World Championship Wrestling than any invasion angle ever could. When Eric Bischoff signed Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash, some of the biggest names in the business, he gave them something extraordinary, something almost unheard of. He gave them creative control over their own characters, written directly into their contracts. On paper, the justification made a certain kind of sense. WCW Backstage was a snake pit. It was a political war zone where bookers changed constantly and rival factions schemed against one another. According to Bischoff himself, Hogan wanted that clause not to be a tyrant, but to protect himself from the infighting he knew would come, a shield against the politics. But here's the problem with handing your biggest star the power to veto anything he doesn't like. Eventually, he's going to use it. And when your biggest star is a man with a decades-long reputation for protecting himself, for making sure he always looks strong, for winning the political games behind the curtain, just as decisively as he won the matches in front of it, that power becomes a loaded weapon aimed directly at the heart of your own storytelling. Hulk Hogan did not become the most famous wrestler on earth by accident. He got there partly through incredible charisma and timing, and partly through a shrewd, relentless understanding of how to steer every situation to his own advantage. That instinct made him a superstar. On this one night, it would help sink a company. The original plan for Starrcade, the plan everyone had been building toward for a year and a half, was simple and it was correct. Sting was going to beat Hulk Hogan clean. A decisive, dominant victory, the kind of win that would establish the hero as the man who finally toppled the empire. The kind of moment that would send 17,000 people home hoarse and hundreds of thousands more cheering in their living rooms. That was the plan. That was good business. That was what the story demanded. And on the afternoon of the show, according to multiple accounts, including Bischoff's own, Hogan changed his mind. He didn't feel it was the right time. He wasn't comfortable lying down and being pinned cleanly in the middle of the ring. So instead of a clean, satisfying, definitive finish, the ending was rewritten into something convoluted, something protected, something that would allow Hogan to lose without ever truly being beaten. Now, in fairness, we have to acknowledge that Bischoff has spent years pushing back against the simplest version of this story. He has insisted that the creative control clause has been wildly overblown in the retelling, that Hogan was collaborative far more often than not, and that this was one of the very few times, perhaps the only time, that Hogan ever really dug in his heels and exercised that power. Bischoff has argued that the disaster that followed wasn't some grand Hogan conspiracy, that Hogan wouldn't have earned a single extra dime from one finish over another, and that what really went wrong was simple, catastrophic miscommunication. And there's truth in that too, because whatever the reason for the change, the execution of the new plan turned a bad situation into an unmitigated catastrophe. Here's what the rewritten finish was supposed to look like. The referee assigned to the match was Nick Patrick, and Nick Patrick was not a neutral figure. For over a year, Patrick had been portrayed as the NWO's crooked referee, the official who always seemed to find a way to help the black and white. So the story was that Patrick, having been selected as the man in the middle, would once again betray WCW. During the match, Hogan would hit his legendary leg drop and Patrick would drop down and deliver a lightning-fast 3 count. A blatant, obvious fast count designed to steal the victory for Hogan. But then, out of nowhere, a savior would appear, Bret Hart. The timing of this was extraordinary. Just over a month earlier, in November of 1997, Bret Hart had been at the center of the most infamous double cross in wrestling history, the Montreal Screwjob, a moment where the World Wrestling Federation, on Vince McMahon's orders, had a referee call for a bell that Hart never agreed to, stripping him of the championship on his way out the door. The entire wrestling world was still buzzing about it. Bret Hart had become the ultimate symbol of a man who had been robbed by a crooked count. So WCW, in a moment of genuine inspiration, decided to use that. Bret Hart was making his pay-per-view debut for the company, and the plan was for him to storm the ring, having just lived through his own screw job, and refuse to let the same injustice happen to Sting. He would knock out the crooked Patrick, restart the match, and this time officiate it fairly. Sting would then lock in his signature hold in the Scorpion Deathlock, force Hogan to submit, and finally win the championship. On paper, even the rewritten version could have worked. It was overly complicated, sure. It robbed the moment of some of its purity. But if executed well, the story of the crooked count being overturned by the man who had just been robbed himself could have landed. And think about what a coup it was to even have Bret Hart in that position. WCW had just landed one of the most respected performers on the planet, a man whose real-life screw job had dominated headlines far beyond wrestling. His arrival should have been a statement. It should have signaled that WCW was the place where wronged legends came to get justice. Instead, his very first major moment on WCW pay-per-view was to walk out and enforce an injustice that the audience couldn't even see. His debut was tied to a finish that didn't work, and so his own momentum was blunted before it ever got started. It was a waste of a golden opportunity layered on top of a waste of a golden opportunity. The trouble was that the single most important element of that entire plan depended on one thing. The fast count had to look fast. The whole story only made sense if the audience clearly saw Nick Patrick screwing Sting. If the count looked normal, then Hogan would simply appear to have won cleanly, and Bret Hart's entire reason for storming the ring would evaporate into thin air. And that is precisely catastrophically what happened. Nick Patrick has told this story many times over the years, and it is one of the most darkly comic examples of how badly a wrestling company can trip over its own feet. According to Patrick, he received two completely contradictory sets of instructions. One of the biggest stars in the match told him to make the count fast. The other told him to count at a normal, slow speed. Two men, two franchise players, both telling him the exact opposite thing, and both absolutely certain that their version was the one that was happening. Put yourself in Patrick's shoes for a moment. You are a referee. You are about to walk into the main event of the biggest show in company history in front of 17,000 screaming fans and hundreds of thousands more at home. And the two most powerful men in that ring have just handed you completely opposite marching orders. Whichever way you count, one of them is going to be furious. Whichever way you count, you're going to be blamed. Patrick tried to find Bischoff to get a definitive answer. He couldn't locate him in the chaos. So, standing there with the clock ticking down toward the most important match of the year, Nick Patrick made a decision that would haunt WCW forever. He decided to split the difference. He would count somewhere in between, a little faster than a normal count, but not the blatant, obvious fast count the story required. Something ambiguous, something that would, in theory, satisfy both men. It satisfied no one, and it destroyed the finish. So let's walk through what the audience actually saw that night, because the disconnect between what was promised and what was delivered is the entire tragedy of Starrcade 1997. The undercard had done its job. Fans had watched Diamond Dallas Page battle Curt Hennig over the United States Championship. They had seen the bizarre spectacle of Eric Bischoff himself stepping into the ring against the veteran Larry Zbyszko with control of Monday Nitro hanging in the balance. The building was warm, the crowd was primed, everything on that card existed to set the table for one dish, and now it was finally time to serve it. Sting's entrance was, by every account, absolutely spectacular. The lights, the crashing thunder, the ominous atmosphere, 18 months of build-up poured into those few minutes as the Silent Avenger finally made his way to the ring for the confrontation everyone had been dreaming about. The crowd was electric. The goosebumps were real. In that moment, everything was still perfect. And then the bell rang and the problems began almost immediately. Remember, Sting had been out of the ring for the better part of 18 months. He hadn't wrestled a real match in over a year. He had been a phantom, an image, a presence. He was not a finely tuned athlete ready to go to war in the ring, and it showed. The man who walked to the ring that night, according to the people running the company, was out of shape. Bischoff would later describe him with brutal frankness as looking like he hadn't seen the inside of a gym or a tanning bed in 6 months. Sting's normally imposing physique looked soft. His skin was pale, missing the deep tan that had always been part of his look. His body language seemed sluggish and uncertain. Some have pointed to this as another layer of the dark truth. Sting was reportedly in a difficult place mentally at that time, dealing with personal struggles away from the ring, and the toll of that showed in his preparation. And when the man who was supposed to be the conquering hero showed up looking like that, it created yet another problem in an already tense backstage environment. There are accounts suggesting that Hogan looked at Sting's condition and saw it as a sign that Sting hadn't taken the biggest match of both their careers seriously enough. Whether that perception was fair or not, it added fuel to a fire that was already burning. And it's worth pausing on this because it points to a failure of planning that goes beyond any one person. If the concern was that Sting was rusty and out of shape, WCW had 18 months to address it. They could have quietly put him in a series of house show matches away from the cameras to knock the rust off and get him back into fighting form while preserving his on-screen mystique. They didn't. They let their biggest asset sit idle for a year and a half and then acted shocked on the day of the show that he wasn't in peak condition. The mistake wasn't just made in the ring that night, it was baked in long before anyone walked through the curtain. So instead of the dominant, decisive war the story demanded, the match itself was strange and one-sided in the wrong direction. Hogan controlled long stretches of it, beating Sting up, sending him to the outside, working him over. The hero, who had been built up for a year and a half as an unstoppable force of vengeance, spent much of his big moment on the receiving end of a beating from the very villain he was supposed to conquer. And then came the finish. Hogan hit the leg drop, Nick Patrick slid into position, and he counted his compromise count. Not fast enough to be an obvious screw job, not slow enough to be a normal count. Just a count, and to the eyes of everyone watching, in the arena and at home, it looked like Hulk Hogan had just pinned Sting 1, 2, 3 cleanly in the middle of the ring. The commentators tried to sell it. They insisted it was a fast count, an outrage, a robbery, but the audience had just watched with their own eyes as Hogan seemingly beat Sting fair and square. There was no visible crime. There was nothing to be outraged about. The crooked count that the entire second half of the story depended on had simply not happened in any way the fans could perceive. And then, right on cue, Bret Hart came marching out to right a wrong that nobody had actually seen occur. He attacked Nick Patrick, he declared that Sting had been robbed by a fast count, and he ordered the match restarted. To the confused audience, this made no sense. From what they had witnessed, Hogan had won. Why was this man they barely knew from another company suddenly overturning a clean victory and forcing the match to continue? The match restarted. Sting hit a Stinger Splash, locked in the Scorpion Deathlock, and Hogan submitted. Sting won the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, and the crowd did pop. Make no mistake, 17,000 people had waited a year and a half for this, and when Sting finally raised that belt, they cheered. The emotional investment was so deep that even a botched, confusing finish couldn't completely erase the joy of seeing the hero finally win. But something was wrong. Something felt hollow. The most anticipated moment in company history had been muddied, confused, drained of its power. Sting hadn't looked dominant, he'd looked rusty and beaten. The screw job that was supposed to add drama had instead just added confusion. And the man who was supposed to be established, once and for all as the conqueror of the New World Order, had won in a way that left everyone scratching their heads instead of leaping out of their seats. The magic that had taken 18 months to build had been squandered in 15 minutes. And here's the detail that tells you everything about how broken WCW's backstage culture had become. When Nick Patrick came back through the curtain after fumbling the most important spot on the most important show of the year, he expected to be fired on the spot. He fully anticipated being handed his walking papers. Instead, nobody said a word to him. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. He collected his bag and left the building, and the subject was simply never raised again. A company that functioned properly would have had a serious conversation about how the biggest finish of the year fell apart. WCW just moved on as if pretending it hadn't happened would make it so. Now here is where the story gets even worse. Because if the botched finish at Starrcade had been the end of it, if WCW had simply moved forward with Sting as a strong, clear champion, the damage might have been contained. A bad finish is a bad finish. Companies recover from those. But WCW didn't move forward. They doubled down on the disaster. The very next night on Monday Nitro, they ran the rematch. Sting versus Hogan again, less than 24 hours after the biggest show of the year. And somehow, incredibly, they botched this one even worse than the first. The rematch was another overbooked mess, another convoluted series of run-ins and referee shenanigans, and the whole thing didn't even finish during the broadcast. The show went off the air before the match reached any kind of conclusion. Imagine that. The blow-off to your biggest feud, and it doesn't even end on television. During the chaos, the crooked NWO referee ended up counting a pin on Sting for Hogan all over again. The message this sent to the audience was devastating. It told them that even after 18 months of build-up, even after the hero finally won the title, nothing was actually resolved. There was no payoff, there was no closure, just more confusion, more nonsense, more nothing, and then came the final insult. In the weeks that followed, on the debut episode of WCW's new show Thunder, the championship that Sting had waited a year and a half to win was simply vacated, taken away. Declared to be held up because of the disputed finishes. And just like that, the title that was supposed to represent the culmination of the greatest story WCW ever told was sitting empty, as if the whole thing had never mattered at all. Sting would eventually win the championship back at Super Brawl in February of 1998. But by then the damage was done and it was permanent. The aura that had made him the most compelling character in wrestling for 18 months, that mystique, that unstoppable phantom quality, it was gone, evaporated. You cannot build a hero into a god for a year and a half and then have him lose control of his own championship in a fog of confusion and expect the audience to still believe in him. The spell had been broken, and it could not be put back together. The Sting who finally got his proper title reign was just another wrestler, now a very good one, but no longer the mythic figure who had haunted the rafters. That version of him died at Starrcade, and he never came back. And here's the human cost of it, the part that gets lost when we talk about buy rates and booking decisions. There were millions of people who had followed this story for a year and a half, kids who stayed up late on Monday nights, adults who arranged their week around Nitro, people who had genuinely emotionally invested in the idea of this silent hero finally getting his revenge. They didn't care about creative control clauses or contract language or backstage politics. They just wanted the story they'd been promised. They wanted the catharsis, and on the one night it was supposed to arrive, it was taken from them and replaced with confusion. That's the part that stings the most all these years later. Not that a business decision was made, but that so much genuine faith and excitement was answered with a shrug. Those fans had held up their end of the bargain completely. They watched, they cared, they paid, and the company simply failed to hold up its own. This is why so many wrestling historians and fans point to Starrcade 1997 not just as a bad show, but as a genuine turning point, as the beginning of the end. Because it wasn't just about one match, it was about what that match revealed. It exposed the rot at the core of the company. It showed that no matter how good the storytelling was, no matter how much the fans invested, the whole thing could be overwritten at the last minute by backstage politics and ego. It proved that WCW could not be trusted to deliver a satisfying conclusion because the people with the real power weren't interested in what was best for the story or the company. They were interested in protecting themselves. And the fans, who are far smarter than any promoter ever gives them credit for, they felt it. They started to understand that these big matches would never truly pay off, that every huge moment would be undercut by some run-in, some crooked count, some overbooked nonsense designed to protect a star's ego rather than reward the audience's loyalty. You can only jerk an audience around so many times before they stop believing, before they stop caring, before they start looking elsewhere. And elsewhere was exactly where they were about to look, because at that very moment, up in the Northeast, the World Wrestling Federation was building towards something, a bald, foul-mouthed, beer-drinking anti-hero named Stone Cold Steve Austin. And just a few months after the Starrcade debacle at WrestleMania 14, Austin would win the WWF Championship in a moment of pure, decisive, satisfying triumph. No confusion, no botched count, no overbooked nonsense, just a hero the audience had chosen, winning clean, in a moment that felt earned. That was the difference, and the audience noticed. The tide of the Monday Night Wars, which had been flowing WCW's way for 83 straight weeks, was about to turn, and it would never turn back. Within months, Raw would retake the ratings lead, and WWF would begin a march to the top of the industry that WCW would never again seriously challenge. Now it would be unfair to lay the entire collapse of WCW at the feet of a single match. The company's death was slow, and it had many causes: the reckless spending, the bloated contracts, the refusal to build new stars while the aging veterans clung to the top of the card, the revolving door of bookers, the disastrous creative decisions that would follow, like the infamous finger poke of doom, where Hogan and Kevin Nash exposed the entire NWO storyline as a sham in one lazy afternoon. There was plenty of blame to go around, and it accumulated over years. But Starrcade 1997 was the moment the pattern was set. It was the template for everything that would go wrong. Take a great idea, build it beautifully, and then at the critical moment, let ego and politics and cowardice strangle the payoff. That happened at Starrcade, and it kept happening again and again until there was nothing left. Until Ted Turner's mighty wrestling empire, the company that had once made Vince McMahon sweat, was sold off to that very same Vince McMahon in 2001 for a fraction of what it had once been worth. The disputed count, the vacated title, the hero, built up for 18 months and then quietly deflated. It all started on that December night in Washington, D.C. So what really is the dark truth behind Starrcade 1997? It's not a single villain. It's not a mustache-twirling conspiracy. The truth is messier and in some ways sadder than that. The dark truth is that a company at the absolute height of its powers, sitting on the greatest story it had ever told, with a guaranteed record-breaking audience already paying to watch, could not get out of its own way. The dark truth is that a contract clause meant to protect one man from politics ended up being the mechanism that let politics destroy the company's biggest moment. The dark truth is that when it mattered most, the people in charge chose to protect an ego instead of rewarding an audience. And the dark truth is that everyone involved seems to know it. Sting himself has spoken about that night with a kind of weary honesty over the years. He has described the whole thing as a package deal of problems that all came crashing together at once. He acknowledges that they had a great build-up for a solid year, and then when it came time to deliver, they simply didn't follow through on what the story had promised. He admits that he and Hogan did not deliver the match the moment deserved, and most tellingly, he has said that the plan was changing right up until the last second, that they didn't even know for certain how they were going to do the finish until they were literally walking through the curtain to the ring. He has agreed plainly that a dominant, clean win for him would have been the right call. That it would have been, in his words, good business. Think about that. The man at the center of it all, the hero of the story, agrees that they got it wrong. He knows what should have happened. He was there. He walked through that curtain, not even sure how his own biggest match was going to end, the most important night of his career, and the finish was still being argued over as he made his entrance. Bischoff, for his part, has spent a quarter of a century trying to complicate the simple narrative. He insists it wasn't a conspiracy, that it was miscommunication, that Hogan is unfairly blamed, that the referee was put in an impossible spot through no fault of his own. And there is genuine merit to some of that. The finish did fall apart largely because of confusion and contradictory instructions, not because of a single act of sabotage. Nick Patrick really was caught between two immovable stars. The execution really was botched in a way that no one seems to have fully intended, but even Bischoff acknowledges the fundamental fact at the heart of all of it. The original plan was for Sting to win clean, and that plan was changed on the afternoon of the show because the biggest star in the company wasn't feeling it. Whatever you call that, whatever motive you assign to it, the result is the same. The story the fans were promised was not the story they got, and the reason it changed had nothing to do with making it better. And that, more than the fast count that wasn't fast, more than the confused restart, more than the vacated title, is the real tragedy of Starrcade 1997. Not that they made a mistake, everyone makes mistakes, but that they had everything, every advantage, the story, the audience, the money, the momentum, and they threw it away, not because they had to, but because the people with the power chose to. There's an old saying in the wrestling business that the boys can't be trusted to book themselves because a wrestler will always protect his own spot ahead of the good of the show. Starrcade 1997 is the ultimate proof of that principle. When you give the inmates the keys, when you let the biggest star override the story whenever his ego demands it, you don't just risk one bad night. You risk everything because the audience is watching and the audience remembers and the audience will eventually walk away. The saddest part of it all is how close they came. If Sting had simply walked down from those rafters, absorbed a bit of offense, and then unloaded 18 months of silent fury on Hulk Hogan before pinning him clean in the center of the ring, Starrcade 1997 would be remembered today as one of the greatest moments in the history of professional wrestling. It would sit alongside the most cathartic payoffs the business has ever produced. The Silent Avenger finally getting his revenge, good triumphing over evil after a year and a half of darkness. That version of the night existed. It was written. It was the plan. It was one decision away from happening. Instead, we got a botched count, a confused crowd, a hero who looked out of shape and beaten, a restart that made no sense, a title win that felt hollow, a rematch that didn't even finish on television, and a championship that got vacated within weeks. We got the beginning of the end. We got a cautionary tale that every promoter in the business would study for decades afterward as the perfect example of how to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And maybe that's the real legacy of Starrcade 1997. It stands as a permanent monument to a simple, brutal lesson that the hardest part of telling a great story isn't the beginning, it's the ending. It's having the discipline, the courage, and the humility to give the audience the payoff they've earned, even when it means someone has to lose, even when it means an ego has to be set aside. Even when the biggest star in the building doesn't feel like it, WCW couldn't do it. And in failing to do it, on the biggest night of the year, in front of a record-breaking audience, they didn't just ruin a match. They revealed exactly what they were. A company that could dream bigger than anyone, but couldn't be trusted to deliver on those dreams. And once the audience learned that lesson, once they truly understood it deep down in their bones, the war was already over. It would just take a few more years for the body to finally stop moving. The greatest angle in wrestling history deserved the greatest payoff in wrestling history. It got one of the worst, and the men who were there, the man who was supposed to win, the man who ran the company, the referee, stuck in the middle of it all. They've spent the decades since trying to explain what went wrong on that December night in Washington. But the explanation, when you strip away all the excuses and the politics and the conflicting accounts, is heartbreakingly simple. They had the perfect story. And when the moment came to finish it, they couldn't get out of their own way. That's the dark truth behind Starrcade 1997. Not a monster in the shadows, just a company with everything to gain, quietly sabotaging itself from within and never quite recovering from the wound. Let me know in the comments how you would have booked Sting versus Hogan at Starrcade. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of wrestling's most infamous nights, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.